Thank you. Welcome everyone. I'm going to pass it over to His Worship Mayor Greg Wilson to open the meeting.
Thanks, Marshallina. I'd like to begin by acknowledging with respect that we are in Treaty 3 territory and that the land we are on, which we are gathered, is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Métis people. So yes, I'm pleased to welcome our star-studded lineup of panelists and want to thank each one of you for taking time this evening to share your knowledge and experience and wisdom on the future management and storage of used nuclear fuel. In the 1970s, down one of the halls on the second floor of Dryden High School outside the library, there used to hang a picture above the water fountain of a parachute in the sky with a caption that read, "Mind like parachute, function only when open." And I've ignored or forgotten other pieces of advice given to me over the decades, but that one sticks with me. And it's been said that when you listen to and read mainly one thinker's perspective, you risk becoming a narrow-minded clone. If you listen to and read only opposing thinkers, you risk becoming confused. When you take in 10 thinkers, you will begin to develop your own voice. And if you listen to and read everything across the spectrum, you'll develop wisdom and find yourself. So our goal as a community at this point is not to show our support or our opposition to nuclear storage projects or to this storage proposal in particular, but to become more educated and acquainted with all the relevant moving parts as the panel engages our questions. And I'm confident that this evening's discussion will move us ahead in that direction, and I do look forward to an informative, candid discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And we are just going to move into an introduction of the panelists. But before we do that, we just want to thank our audience again for joining us. And thank you, Mayor Wilson, for taking the time to provide the introduction today. We know how busy you are. Just going to start by saying that my name is Marshallina Reeder, and I'm very grateful to be here this evening with my colleague and co-host Tyler Peacock. And as everybody learned while we were doing our little warm-up session, that Tyler is really the technical genius without whom I'd be completely lost here. We would also like to acknowledge our Chief Administrative Officer, Roger Nesbitt, Mayor and Council for their visionary leadership in recognizing the value of listening to each other with equal tolerance as we have been learning together. Although diverse perspectives of the proposed DGR development certainly does exist, our common ground has been, in general, matters of health and safety for our communities, for our country, which includes environmental stewardship, energy conservation and sustainability for future generations. And we're very happy that some of Dr. Denev's students are here with us this evening, food security, medical advancements, and the like. This is really the reason that this panel came to be. As hosts, we will open the conversation asking questions that draw out some of the high-level themes and trends our stakeholders have identified. We will read a question and call upon a panelist to begin the dialogue. Please present your views and opinions regarding the subject matter. We encourage interaction between you and are looking forward to some friendly banter, much as we did in the warm-up. We invite the audience to submit additional questions to the Q&A feature in the top right corner of your screen. Tyler will be monitoring those audience questions, and we should note that all questions on the agenda may not be addressed dependent upon how many questions are posed in that chat or Q&A feature. However, we will certainly be scheduling some additional events in the future, so we will continue to make every effort that any questions not addressed this evening will be brought forward. The following provides a brief summary of our standard panel discussion guidelines for the evening. We ask that you add to points of view, facts, or the science already stated. Ask questions of each other for clarification of any point made if that is necessary. It is not required that each panelist answer every question. Please make every effort to keep the answers succinct and relatable. We really want our stakeholders to understand the relationship between the facts and the science that you're going to present to them today and make that a little bit more relatable for them. Please do keep it conversational and raise your hand if you have something new to say or additional. Only one panelist will speak at a time, we ask. And we also ask that you keep in mind our time constraints. And of course, please do have fun. Our goal here is to generate insight and encourage continued knowledge seeking. Healthy debate in the first event of this kind in the City of Dryden can support and promote future such stakeholder learning and engagement opportunities. We are also very happy to share with everyone this evening that in honor of our panelists, our residents, council, and staff who have engaged in this process thus far and submitted their questions and concerns, and really who have made this event possible, that we will be making donations in the amount of $1,000 to each of the following organizations: the Dryden Native Friendship Center, Firefly Dryden, and Four Directions program of the Dryden High School. We wish to thank our panelists for identifying these organizations. And again, this is in keeping with the community's safety and well-being initiatives. Before commencing with your brief introductions, we would like to ask each of you to share with us one word or short phrase. And sorry, panelists, you did not know that this was going to happen, but surprise. So one word or a short phrase that comes to mind when you think of public engagement as it relates to Canada's long-term plans for nuclear waste management.
Can I start?
You absolutely may.
My word is essential. It's absolutely essential that we have these kind of dialogues like we're having tonight.
Thank you very much. Who would like to go next?
I'll go.
Thanks, Kim.
Mine is saving the world.
Okay.
Equality across all cultures.
And I'll say, honestly, the first word that came to mind was resilience. And I think it's because we have to be resilient as a community and as members of the public to engage with each other and be in discussion.
Thank you.
I like Kimberly's better than mine. I was just going to say listening. But I like saving the world. Can I change my vote?
You're going to do a ditto, Dr. Ditto.
No, I do think listening is what I'm going to say the most important part is.
Okay. Thank you kindly. And what we will do is we will return to those when we enter into the public engagement segment of our agenda this evening. So thank you very much for participating in that. So we will now follow up with introductions, brief introductions by all of the panelists. And Mr. Burton, if you would please begin with sharing a bit about yourself.
Sure. So my name is Patrick Burton. I'm the Acting Director of the Waste and Decommissioning Division at the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And it really is a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. A quick bit about myself. I'm a mechanical engineer by education. I've been with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission since 2004. I'm going to start saying Cnsc because Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is a bit of a mouthful to keep repeating. I've been in a variety of roles. I've been a nuclear inspector. I've helped to make sure that Canada was living up to our international obligations on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. So now I find myself in the Waste and Decommissioning Division, which is a fantastic role. It's very central. It's cross-cutting across all different aspects of the nuclear industry. And one of the roles that comes with that division is the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. And so that's why I'm here with you tonight. I'm joined tonight by my colleagues, Dr. Nana Kwamina and Dr. Julie Brown. This is a typical Cnsc move. The NWMO is a large, complicated, high-profile file, and we take a team approach to these things. So we had our list of questions in advance, and I've consulted widely. So if you see me from time to time glancing off to the left, it's because we've wandered into an area that's outside my own personal expertise, and I'll be reading from some stuff that colleagues of mine with expertise in those areas have supplied. I'll leave it there. It's a pleasure to be here again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Deneuve, over to you.
Yes, good evening. First of all, I would like to thank the council for the invitation to participate in this really important panel, and I appreciate it very much. I have been living for 15 years in the traditional territory of Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. And I also would like to take this moment to acknowledge the reawakened trauma of Indigenous people across Canada because of the residential school experiences. And I just want to acknowledge that publicly because it's in the forefront of Canadian consciousness at this time. And I do pray that finally the healing and reconciliation can truly begin. I say that because for most of my professional life, I worked across cultures to work with Indigenous people to have their voices heard. And since we were invited to add something personal to the published biography, I want to mention that a journey began for me, a very important journey, upon a visit to Kenora more than 40 years ago. That was a major turning point in my life. And there were two events that stand out that relate to why I'm here this evening. One event that I attended was a community gathering of concerned citizens who were fighting against a nuclear waste dump being proposed in Northern Ontario more than 40 years ago. And I was so incredibly impressed by how organized these people were, how informed they were, the information they had gathered, and they succeeded in stopping that particular nuclear waste dump. And it feels almost like my life is coming full circle today. And the second important event for me was I had encounters with many Indigenous people during that visit, but what really impressed me was a talk given at a public workshop by the late spiritual elder Robin Green, who was Ojibwe, and he was the northern doorkeeper of the Medewan Lodge. And he was in a workshop instructing the Ministry of Natural Resources that he did not need to be told how to fish or how to protect the fish populations. And he was so plain speaking and eloquent. He knew who he was. And I was so profoundly impressed by that I remember it to this moment. Just being so moved by witnessing his talk. And really the experiences in Kenora during that visit propelled me to become a freelance journalist and to focus on Indigenous issues throughout my journalism work and also my educational work. And so that is my introduction for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Greer. Dr. Denev.
Hi, my name is Jason Donev, or Donev. Different people say it different ways. My own family can't seem to agree on that. So I'm a physicist, and I came to the University of Calgary specifically because they were looking at getting a nuclear power plant in Alberta. So one of the questions I always get is, would you raise your family next to a nuclear power plant? Would you raise your family next to a deep geologic repository? And the answer is yes. I would actually move my entire family just for the opportunity to live and work and raise my family next to a nuclear power plant or a nuclear waste repository, because, you know, myself and every nuclear expert I know understands why these are so essential to the long-term health of our planet and why it's the only way we can really fight climate change. We need solar, we need wind, we need hydro, and we absolutely need nuclear power. And when I started teaching about nuclear power at the University of Lowell, I was really skeptical. I thought it was a terrible thing. As somebody who cares a lot about the environment, as somebody who's very concerned about climate change, I was convinced that nuclear power was going to be a really terrible thing. And I was wrong. And it was really important for me to listen, as the mayor had talked about, listen with an open mind about a lot of my preconceptions about nuclear power were simply wrong. And they were based on, things I had seen on The Simpsons and things I had heard about nuclear bombs, and I equated nuclear bombs to nuclear power, and they aren't the same thing at all. So the more I learned about nuclear power, the more passionate I became about how, to quote my colleague, Kimberly Mitchell, how important it is for us to save the world to have nuclear power, because climate change is real, it's bad, it's us, and it's time we do something about it. Something personal for me that has nothing to do with this, I play guitar, because I thought we were supposed to come up with something completely unrelated. My students have pointed out to me that not only do I play guitar, but I write silly songs about how it's absolutely essential for us to have nuclear power in order to save the world. Those have not gone up on YouTube yet. My students have been harassing me about that, about how important it is to sort of get the silly part of the enthusiasm out, because the nuclear industry isn't terribly good at being, no, really, yes, 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 because we tend to be very quiet and staid about the whole thing. But no, I think it's time to actually start letting our passion show that, and I want to do that through silly folk songs played on guitar. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Miss Lloyd.
Yes, thank you. My name is Bernane Lloyd, and I work with Northwatch. We're a regional coalition in Northeastern Ontario, a coalition of primarily environmental groups, also peace groups, women's groups, some cottagers groups, and so on. And we were formed in the late 1980s, and one of our one of the influences in our moving from a couple of regional networks to a coalition at that time was two very large governmental processes, one on timber management, and the other one was the federal review of Atomic Energy of Canada's geological disposal concept, sort of the precursor to NWMO's adaptive phase management. And what we saw as volunteer, community, and district-based groups is we saw a need and a value in having a regionally representative voice to allow, enable, and support public participation in these larger processes. And since our founding, we've worked with our partners and neighbors in the Northwest, particularly around electricity planning and nuclear waste concerns, which are really very shared concerns, and they're Northern Ontario-wide concerns, not specific to the Northeast or the Northwest. And we were very active participants in the ACL review from 88 to 98, and have tracked the NWMO prior to its creation and since its formation in 2002. And our interest is in really engaging and supporting in a public examination of the NWMO and other related initiatives, processes, projects related to nuclear technologies. And I'm happy to be here tonight. I'm in the Northwest from time to time, and happy to be connecting virtually this evening through the kind invitation of the City of Dryden. And I'm joining this evening from my residence, which is on the territory of the overlapping territory of Kebewek First Nation, which is Algonquin unceded territory, and Nipissing First Nation, which is Robinson Huron Treaty Area. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And Miss Mitchell.
Good evening. Wow, I don't know if my introduction is going to be as exciting as some of those, but I will certainly give it a whirl. I am Kimberly Mitchell. I'm a member of the Halibu Mi'kmaq First Nation, which is in Eastern Canada. I moved to Ontario almost 20 years ago now, and I have worked with nuclear technology for almost 20 of those years since I've been in Ontario. Northern Ontario has a very high place in my heart. Many of my immediate family members live in Northern Ontario, both in the Northeast and you know, for me, sort of as I said in the beginning, as a child, I always wondered what my mission was in life. I've sort of got this interesting and eclectic mix of skills. And one of the reasons that I'm really happy to be here tonight is my scientific background, as well as my skills in communication and public speaking, have really led me to a place where I find that I'm able to make science more relatable to the average person. And so I'm very honored to be participating this evening, and I hope we get some really good discussion.
Thank you very much. Well, appreciate that, everyone. We will now begin our agenda for the evening, if everyone is okay with that. And the first segment on the agenda is, of course, a very important topic to most of the folks who have sent in questions and concerns for us, and that is safety and transportation. So we will begin with Ms. Lloyd, who recently did a delegation to the Dryden Council. And Ms. Lloyd, if you could kick off the question of the science to date regarding the testing of used fuel transportation package is still being disputed. So what if the NWMO experiences a breach in the transportation package caused by a highway accident that impacts the environment? So the follow-up questions to that is, what happens next? How can we be certain the fuel will be properly retrieved and contained afterwards? What are the possible environmental effects to water, wildlife, people, air, and other? And how long might the effects last? We can repeat those again, but Ms. Lloyd, if you'd like to kick that off, please.
Great, thank you, Marcelina. And I'm going to approach the question a little bit more broadly, because I think the concerns are a little broader than that. And in that, the transportation risk, the risks associated, and I'm going to say risk is the possibility of harm, not the certainty of harm, the possibility of harm. That's what risk. And risk is usually this combination of consequence and probability. But the risk begins with what's called routine transportation under normal conditions. So normal in this conversation means without upset or accident. So that's where the concern begins, is just the exposure to normal transportation. And the NWMO, it was interesting in the early period during what's called the NWMO study period, 2002 to 2005, they did a number of reports on transportation, but none of them actually talked about exposure or dose or you know, sort of the those effects or concerns. They have done a few more recently. I think 2014 to 2016, they did 3 different reports. I think the third one actually just combined the first 2, and they were on worker and public exposure. The first set of concerns is around that routine exposure. And the NWMO, in their studies, they present a very minimal level of exposure. And that's different from other jurisdictions. That's different from the estimates in, say, the United States, estimates by the state of Nevada, some estimates we've seen out of the UK. So we haven't quite gotten at why those differences are there. And it's partly because we haven't had the opportunity to really delve deeper below those studies. And I think that there's still a lot of blanks to be filled in, even in terms of the container. So exposures, both in routine and in accident conditions, happen because of a combination of what's in the container, how effectively the container shields, and then what if the container is breached. And that's when we get into accident scenarios. So our starting point is that there's no safe level of exposure. So the Cnsc, the NWMO tend to talk a lot in terms of background exposure, but exposures from radioactive transportation radioactive waste transportation, either under routine or in accident conditions, are additional to background. So it's not, you know, it really doesn't work to say, oh, well, it's going to be lower than background, because it might be that additional may be lower than background, but it's additional, it's background plus source. So then when we get to accidents, there are still more uncertainties, but so it depends on, you know, if it was a lower impact accident, the releases may be just from surface contamination. So if it was a higher impact accident, then if there was to be a breach of the container, then there would be a greater amount of release, greater amount of impact and exposure. And then we get to your questions about, so who does what about that? Some of our concerns are about the who does what, is that from our assessment, we are concerned about the level of training and support, immediate on the ground support for first responders. And I'll give you as an example, we did do with the Ontario Law Foundation, we did a small study of training and training materials provided to first responders, looking mostly at volunteer fire departments, some professional fire departments. It was a small study, a number of interviews, some surveys, and what we found was that the first responders mostly relied on the emergency safety guide, I believe it's called. And we were concerned with that because when we looked at that, it really minimized the risk. And in fact, it states in the pages related, in the guides related to radioactive materials, that there is minimal risk associated with this material. That language isn't there for the other materials, but it is there for the radioactive materials. And we don't think that that's the case. We don't think it is minimal risk. We understand, and maybe Patrick can add to this, we understand that the role of the first responders is to secure the site until a specialist team comes in. But if the first responders are being told it's minimal risk, we think that's insufficient information, inadequate training. So I think
I'm just going to stop you there. You did a great, segue into Patrick. We're going to try and keep everybody in and around that 3-minute mark, okay? Otherwise, we're going to run over.
I need that reminder. Thank you.
So Patrick, it was a little bit of a segue into you there. So we're just going to let that naturally happen.
Let's do it. So I'm going to start with just a very few quick words about the Cnsc. We're Canada's independent nuclear regulatory agency. So we are not the NWMO. We are not a nuclear proponent. We really are doing our job to make sure that what nuclear activity there is in Canada is done safely. So the transport question and the science regarding the testing of the used fuel container. I can share with everyone on the call that this is an extremely highly regulated activity. So Bernine, actually, I agree with a lot of what Bernine just said there. The idea that we look at risk, so probability and consequence. If you have a large container full of spent fuel, then you have to take it very seriously because the potential for a consequence is there. And so we expect people who are going to be seeking approval to move those kind of things to demonstrate to us how the probability of that material getting out is extremely, extremely low. And for transport, they do that via that container. The container has to be extremely robust. And Bernine used exactly the right languages. Normal operations when you're driving down the road on a sunny day and everything goes well, and then credible accident conditions. We've probably all been on the road and seen nasty car crashes. What happens if it's the truck with spent fuel on the back that's in that nasty car crash? So the container, and this is one of these areas where I've reached out to my transport specialists. They have informed me that it has to be certified by us. So the licensee says, here's my design. They have to show us that it's been tested under severe accident conditions. So that involves sequentially a 9-meter drop onto an unyielding hard surface, and then a 30-minute exposure at 800 degrees Celsius to simulate a fire, and then 8 hours of immersion under 15 meters of water. And the expectation is that that container will be sound at the end of all of that. And so Bernayne touched on the idea of a low impact and surface contamination, and that should absolutely not be the case. Any kind of traffic accident up to and including the most severe that you're going to find out there, that container should hold its material inside. The emergency response guide. So when I reached out to my transport people, that's exactly what they said, Bernayne. So you're bang on that one. It's a Transport Canada document. They provide it free of charge to first responders, and it's the idea that it is the grab this first quick reference guide. And I believe the content in there for this kind of accident is pretty high level. It is, as Bernayne described, it is set up a perimeter, it is keep the site secure, and it is wait for a specialist team to come. I hope it doesn't say something in there but minimize risk. So I've taken a note of that, and I'm going to go back to my transport people and see if that's the case, because personally that's language that I would be surprised to see on spent fuel. What else can I say here?
Patrick, we may have to come back to you. I'm going to pass it over to Sandy. She's got her hand up.
Sounds good.
Jason, you're next.
Oh, okay, so yes, first of all, I respect Bernayne's knowledge, and I also would like to point out that Dodi Legasek, who works with Environment North, gave an excellent presentation about transportation a couple of weeks ago, I believe, for the Ignis Community Liaison Committee, which I hope is recorded. And definitely, I hope the PowerPoint that she presented would be available to the public if people want to look that up. And I want to add to Bernayne's comments about the dangers is, what about the truck falling over, and even though everything appears to be intact on the surface from the outside of all of these robust containers, what if the tipping over and the vibration?
Sorry, Sandy, you went muted there.
Okay, sorry, thank you. So what if ultimately a truck falling hard on the road or off the road causes defects in the fuel bundles inside the containers that are supposed to be protective? But how do we know whether those bundles might become defective? And when they arrive at the site for the DGR, the Deep Geological Repository, first they go to what's called a processing plant above ground, or more accurately, a repackaging plant, because they have to be repackaged. But defects in the bundles could cause exposures to workers. And so it's very important that there be methods to be able to identify defects in the fuel bundles. And that's all I wanted to add here. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Tanev, let's pass it over to you, and then we will we'll end with Kimberly on this topic. Folks, panelists, there's a couple of questions in the chat. Maybe we can try and address those with the last two panelists.
Okay, I'll try and address Brian Beaton's comment later. As to how long it would take to get there, that's something that the CNSC and the NWMO can work out as part of the safety case. As far as the 9-meter drop, these used fuel containers in other countries have actually been tested with running trains into them. So the description that Patrick gave of the tests is not actually exhaustive of all the tests that have been done. The thing I'd like to say about nuclear safety is that the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is paid to be paranoid, and they do a really good job of going, okay, well, what if something we haven't thought of happens? And then they hold the NWMO to that, which is kind of cool. So we got asked a series of questions on this one. I'm going to try and go through them as quickly as I can. So the statement, the science to date regarding tests of used fuel transportation is being disputed. I dispute that statement. The Canadian nuclear industry has been transporting far more radioactive packages for decades. We transport medical isotopes, which are way more radioactive than anything that's coming through a used fuel container. And we have been doing thousands and thousands of these for decades. And these medical isotopes are saving people from cancer and are diagnosing potentially fatal diseases. And we have been transporting that since the 1960s. And you know what? There's never been an accident that has caused harm to nature. There has never been an accident that has caused harm to people because of radioactive release from the transport of things that are far more radioactive than this. So I dispute the statement that this science is actually disputed. It's been well established for decades. What happens next? Whichever organization is responsible for the transport will come and pick it up. There's a lot of details that go into that, but it will be taken care of. And if they don't, people will pay heavy fines and people may very well wind up in jail. The regulator has the ability to shut down any operation that isn't safe. And that's why the CNSC needs to be arm's length and is arm's length from the rest of the nuclear industry, including the NWMO, which is also arm's length from the rest of the nuclear industry. Possible environmental effects to water, wildlife, people, and air. So the thing about radiation is that it's invisible and people tend to think of it as being sort of like a virus, but it's actually more like a flashlight. So when you've got something that's radioactive, it's like a flashlight that's giving off light. And as soon as you put it inside something, you can't see the light anymore. So the used fuel container is actually like a box that's not letting the light of the flashlight through. So in terms of what if the truck tips over or what if there's an accident, while the public does not necessarily have access to Geiger counters, it's actually remarkably easy to detect these things. Other things that are toxic and cause problems to the environment are a lot harder to detect reliably than radiation. Does the presence of inclement weather impact the transportation safety case? It does, but the thing is, you don't have to transport these fuel bundles at any particular time. So if you want to say, as part of the safety case, that the only way we're going to be allowed to transport spent fuel is if there isn't snow on the road, then the NWMO can actually sit down and say, we're going to go ahead and organize this so that's the only time this is going to happen. This is all part of the negotiation that happens with what the safety case is. Is there anything else missing? Well, in regards to transportation, I encourage you to have a conversation with the NWMO's Transportation Division. They're happy to talk with people. And this set of questions is a really long, complicated set of questions. And I don't feel any of us have actually had a chance to fully say what we have on our mind, but I encourage people to talk to the NWMO safety, transportation safety. They're thinking carefully about this and they want to talk to you about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Kimberly, you're up.
Thank you. I did want to clarify a few items. One on worker and public exposure. In the design of containers used for the shipment of any radioactive item, whether that's a medical isotope that's on its way to a cancer treatment, or whether it's radioactive water that's being shipped on the highway, or whether it's used fuel, one of the key requirements that the CNSC has is that an individual of the public never be exposed to a level of radiation at a level that would cause cancers, for example. And so what that requirement means practically is that a person could stand flat against the side of that container and hug it all day long, and they would still not receive any more radioactive dose than they would receive as a person who goes about their daily life. And so I did want to just clarify that. In terms of the studies that the NWMO have done on worker dose, some questions that might be relevant for people to ask are, can you tell me about the assumptions that went into calculating these numbers? For example, it's not uncommon for tractor trailers to have specially designed transportation packages that keep the containers far back from the driver. And the purpose of doing that is to lower the amount of radioactive dose that the driver receives in the time that the package is being transported. So there are measures that go into determining exactly the calculated dose level for the driver. it's not in anybody's interest to have workers or have members of the public exposed to radioactivity. That's one of the first things that gets said to you when you work in the nuclear industry. Accidents or incidents harm all nuclear operators. And even minor incidents really undermines the confidence that people have in the industry's ability to function safely. And so that's why the CNSC upholds these standards so rigorously. One item that I would encourage people to have a look for after the meeting tonight or at their earliest opportunity is some of the research being done by Dr. Douglas Borum at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. Dr. Borum researches safe levels of radiation exposure. There are several different models that one of which was mentioned earlier, which is the concept that there is no safe level of exposure. And some of Dr. Borum's research has showed that at lower levels of radiation dose, there's actually a beneficial effect due to effects where harmful bacteria may be killed by low levels of radiation. And so there are varying models out there, and there isn't 100% agreement in the scientific community on which model is the right model. And so I would encourage people to ask more open-ended questions of, for example, the NWMO, when they come with a report on radiation exposure, ask them which radiation exposure model was assumed when the NWMO performed their calculations.
Thank you, Kim. We're going to try and move to the next question, but Bernane, I'll give you 30 seconds and then Patrick the same.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of things that I think need follow-up on, and I think we can't come to conclusion partly because there's so much more to say than we have time to discuss, but a few quick points. One is the cask that CNSC has recertified and recertified for used fuel transportation is the cask that Ontario Hydro developed as a companion to the ACL concept in the hearings in the 1990s. So I think that there needs to be a much more thorough and much more public examination of that cask and its shielding capacity and what the assumptions are in that. The scientific review group at the time said that there was insufficient qualitative data to come to a conclusion on that container. I think, Patrick, I'll just point you, it's 163 is the guide I'd like you to look at, and it's for low and high level radioactive waste. The others are similarly problematic, but I think that one particularly so. And Kim, I'm aware that Bruce Power is funding research at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. I would refer people to the National Academy of Sciences. I think it's reputable work. I think that it's reliable work. And I think the Beer 7 report, Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation, is the go-to study on effects of radiation. Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission accepts it. I would be very surprised if the NWMO was disputing the Beer 7 conclusions. And I don't know if I can find a link for that, but I will forward a link. Maybe Marcelina, you could include it in any follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Patrick, go ahead.
I'll just say 2 points really quickly. For the Cnsc, I just want to stress that for the NWMO's project, we are pre-licensing, and so there's a lot of points that are being raised right here. And the Cnsc, we've been engaging with the NWMO for a long time. They have not yet applied for a license, and for us, that's when the machine really starts. And so, for instance, there's talk about has the NWMO evaluated dose? If you Google that, there is documentation from the NWMO on the internet. For the Cnsc right now, that's an interesting factoid. It's got some very low numbers in it. We have not yet put those through our very thorough licensing application process. Second point, someone in the chat was asking about how much volume of used fuel there is. I'm looking to the left here so much because I'm dredging up a link to Canada's report, the 7th National Report on the Joint Convention on Radioactive Waste and Used Nuclear Fuel. That's another bit of a mouthful. It's a public report. It has inventory information on radioactive waste in Canada, including used nuclear fuel. So if you bear with me a moment, I'll find that link and I'll post it in the chat.
Thank you.
Marcelina, let's jump over to the next one. I know there's a lot of stuff happening in the chat. Just a reminder, if people have questions, please use the Q&A and leave the chat for just some comment back and forth.
No comments. Well, I think actually, Tyler, I believe we may have touched on this question, but we were going to ask Mr. Burton to respond to what role does the CNSC and Transport Canada play in transportation oversight, and what is the expectation for NWMO to provide affected municipalities and councils the answers they need?
So as I touched on earlier, Cnsc has a role in overseeing the transport of radioactive material in Canada. Transport Canada also has a role in that. So essentially both organizations have regulations that speak to the safety of transport. Cnsc's are more specific to radioactive material. Transport Canada's are more general to hazardous material. So it could be radioactive, it could be some kind of chemical hazard. The Cnsc's regulations are based on the IAEA's regulations, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And so it was described earlier how there's a lot of experience about transport of radioactive substances in Canada. There's a lot of experience to do with the transportation of used nuclear fuel internationally. And that experience gets into the IAEA regulations, and then we incorporate those regulations into our own. So even though we aren't routinely transporting large quantities of used fuel, there are other places in the world where they are, and we benefit from that. Expectation for the NWMO to provide affected municipalities and councils the answers they need. I would say we do expect them to do that. So we look at licensees and applicants across a wide variety of areas, and two of the areas that we look at are public information and disclosure and Indigenous engagement. Another one is emergency management. So if someone comes to us and says, I want to hypothetically move a whole bunch of used fuel from Point Lepreau in New Brunswick all the way to Ignace in Ontario, we would say, how are you going to do it safely? That's a long way. How are you going to make sure that if an accident happens anywhere along that route, that you're prepared? Tell us your plan. So we don't have a prescriptive plan that says you need to inform every municipality of this and that. We say, give us your case. And our experts in emergency management examine that case. And we do not accept that case until our experts are happy with it. The other side of that is the public information and disclosure and the Indigenous engagement. We expect that our licensees and applicants are telling people who have a stake in their work about their work. We don't want it to be some kind of secret plan. We don't want people who are impacted by this or feel impacted by this in some way to feel like they can't get the information. And so we do have requirements in place that require our licensees and our applicants to disclose a lot of information. The NWMO is disclosing a lot of information, and again, they're not an applicant yet, so we haven't gone through it yet to see if they are meeting our requirements on that. But I think that's the high-level answer, that these are topics that are very close to our heart, and we make sure that our licensees meet the requirements that we have in place in those areas. Is that answering the aspects of your question there, Marcelina, or have I missed something?
No, I believe that is exactly what we were looking for. Tyler, did you have another question?
No, that covers it. There are plenty of questions coming in the chat and the Q&A, and I'm frantically trying to see if they fit in. But I think what we'll do is try and pick up a few at the end of the session. So I continue on, Marceline, with the next question.
Okay, thank you. Well, I should ask the panelists, was there anyone who wanted to add anything to that? I think Patrick provided. Dr. Deneuve, go ahead.
One of the things that confuses people who are not working within the nuclear industry, because there's a lot of acronyms thrown around, the Canadian Nuclear Association, Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. The Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is not a pro-nuclear advocacy group. They are not run by the nuclear industry. To address one of the questions that came up in the chat, the NWMO is not owned by Bruce Power or Ontario Hydro or Ontario Power Generation, as it's called more currently, although it was called Ontario Hydro earlier. They are arm's length. They are separate. and they have actually been coming out. Like I've been in Dryden while they've been in Dryden to talk with people. They're wanting to talk with people. One of the questions that came up was, you know, is it possible to duck out? If so, how? And the answer is yes, it's absolutely possible to duck out. And the NWMO is being quite transparent about that. The CNSC is being quite transparent about that. The difficulty is that people don't know who the CNSC is. People don't know who the NWMO is. So it's often assumed that it's all part of this same club, and it's just not.
Thank you for those comments. And that is one of the hopes of this evening, is that people will learn to have better understanding of those. So we will be moving on now to environmental stewardship. And actually, Dr. Deneuve, we will be starting with you here. Of the three options for dealing with nuclear waste, the deep geological repository, responsible stewardship, recycling, why is option number 1 NWMO's preferred option? And what are the pros and cons to each option? It's a fairly loaded question. Has a formal risk analysis comparing the three options been achieved? And are there results available for the public to review?
I'll answer the first one, the last question first. Are the results available for the public to review? Yes. There is so much information out there all over the place. A lot of it's very technical. Is it available? Yes. Is it readable? Meh. Less so, perhaps. So just because it's available doesn't mean it's going to be easy to read, because a lot of it is thick, thorough, technically dense information. Talking about the three different options, deep geologic repository, responsible stewardship, and recycling. It's a little misleading to present those three things, but I will say that every single country that has nuclear power has nuclear waste. You know, any sort of generation. You have solar power generates waste. You have wind power generates waste. You have coal-fired power plants, it spreads radioactive material all over the countryside, and a lot of other problems too. Whatever your source of energy, there's always waste. Every country that has nuclear power has nuclear waste that needs to be dealt with. And to answer one of the questions that was in the chat, every country that I'm aware of, and I haven't checked on this for a couple of years, but every country that I'm aware of is planning on dealing with their own spent nuclear fuel. So Canada will not take the US's spent nuclear fuel. Politically, that would just be a nightmare. Geologically, it would probably be fine, but just nobody wants that. The Americans don't want that. The Canadians don't want that. So every country is dealing with its own spent nuclear fuel, and every country, even the ones that are doing recycling, are still doing a deep geologic repository. So recycling does not get us around the need to have a safe, secure, long-term storage plan. Because even if you recycle, there's still waste left over at the end of the day. The way the NWMO is designing their deep geologic repository is to allow what they call adaptive phased management, where they can in fact take out the spent nuclear fuel. So you've got this fireplace bundle size thing that goes into the ground. And if we get to a point with the technology with a molten salt reactor, a fast breeder reactor or something, that technology isn't here right now. We don't have that technology yet. We're working on it. But if we develop that, we'll be able to pull this back out for a long period of time after the DGR is started. So the NWMO plan has contingencies for having that recycling piece be part of it. I hope they do. I think it'd be really exciting if they could recycle it. A lot of the recycling that happens in other countries like France wouldn't work in Canada because we have a different type of nuclear fuel. I can go into more detail if people want that. I'm seeing a lot of physics type questions in the chat, and Gordon, I would love to sit down and talk to you about thermodynamics at some point. I see you have a lot of questions about thermodynamics, and I'm happy to go through that with you if you like. But there just isn't space within this panel. So,
Jason, I think
when it comes to having a deep geologic repository, you know exactly where it is. It's out of the biosphere. It's not in where people are living. It's underground. You know exactly where the stuff is. That's one of the really neat things about spent nuclear fuel. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission knows where every single nuclear reactor's spent fuel rod is. Every bundle that has gone into a reactor, they know exactly where that is coming out. If it's stored above ground, which I think is what's meant by responsible stewardship, the concern is that you could potentially have long-term problems because you have to watch it forever. If you put it underground, you don't need to watch it anymore. So every country in the world has come to basically the same conclusion. The Deep Geologic Repository is a safe, long-term disposal of this. And I see that Dr. Greer is disagreeing with me. I assume that the head shaking is that you'd like to go next?
Sorry, I'm gonna let Kimberly jump in, and then Sandy, Dr. Greer, we'll get you up there next, okay? After Ms. Mitchell.
Thank you. I did just want to, I do see there's quite a bit of chat in the box about the characteristics of the fuel itself. So I did want to elaborate on that a little because it's significant with respect to the science. Canada's reactors are unique in the world in terms of the fuel that they use, because Canadian nuclear reactors use unenriched uranium. What that means is when parts of the Canadian Shield are excavated in order to get the uranium ore, there's no chemical or mechanical separation processes done to separate the uranium metal. The fuel that we manufacture in Canada is actually a ceramic. It's uranium oxide. And the benefit that we get from that in Canada is that the melting point of our fuel is just over 1,000 degrees Celsius higher than you would see at a typical light water reactor. And that type of reactor is the type of reactor that was present at Fukushima, and it's the type of the reactor that operates throughout much of the US. So our fuel design is quite unique because we have this lower level of uranium in the fuel. A related effect is that it's very difficult actually to get Canadian reactors to stay online. If our fuel bundles and our reactor cores lose their geometry or their shape. Dr. Deneuve held up a fuel bundle several times, and you can see that it's a series of small tubes arranged in a concentric circle. If one of those tubes or a number of those tubes were to detach from that fuel bundle, the reaction stops. And it's one of the great strengths that our reactor type has in the world in general. Because we use this natural uranium, it makes recycling a little more complicated than you would see at a plant in France, for example, because all of the uranium and the fission products or the radioactive components that are made as a result of the reaction, they actually get trapped inside of that ceramic matrix. And it's one of the design features that actually prevents the escape of radioactivity in the form of dust, for example, because the fission products themselves are stuck inside of a solid ceramic, which is then contained in a metal tube, which is then contained in the large shipping container. And so having this oxide form of nuclear fuel does complicate recycling a little, because we now have to break apart this very strongly covalent bond in order to be able to process the uranium. And so in Canada, recycling is something that's probably far off for us. The amount of dusts, the amount of risk in terms of spreading radiation is likely higher in a recycling facility, just because you have to turn those components into either a liquid or a dust in order to facilitate the chemical reactions that need to happen in order to separate out the various components. There's certainly not something that's easily deployed. And so for that reason, our fuel is a little more difficult to recycle in the way that you might see in a country like France. At the same time, there are some new reactor types that can utilize our fuel almost in its current form, could be a way to think about it. These are reactors that have different radioactive processes, and those would take quite a bit of design work in order to bring them into operation in Canada. So in terms of the options that are available to us, there are quite a few technical barriers to putting recycling in place. One of
Kimberly,
yeah.
Can I interject and just get, sorry to stop you. I know this is a big question, but I do want to hear from Dr. Greer, and maybe we can come back to you if there's time.
Okay. Yes. So, okay. I'd like to speak to two issues. I just would like to disagree with Jason if he's suggesting there is international consensus about DGRs, because that is not accurate, even though that's, you know, frequently publicized, particularly by the NWMO. And I urge everyone to read an international report called the World Nuclear Waste Report 2019. It's mostly based in Europe with the authors who are nuclear scientists who've worked with the nuclear industry through many years. And they actually raise issues about the DGR, which still has a lot of contradictions and inconsistencies in terms of it being the best option. And people also need to be reminded that there is no operating DGR for high-level waste yet existing anywhere in the world. And Finland is still busy on its construction phase, but it still has not even sought out an operating license. So we're talking about the DGR still is an experiment. It's been a concept for many decades, and I think we need to think about what are the reasons why it's taking so long, and there's still a lot of issues not resolved, and the science is still not there. And I would like to agree, for the most part, with Kimberly about recycling, and there's a reason why that was not one of the NWMO options. I've been reading halfway through a 455-page report by the NWMO that they published in 2005 called Choosing a Way Forward. And on PDF page 118, they spell out why recycling is not a viable option in Canada. So I'll just read a few sentences quickly. It is unlikely that Canada would need to implement reprocessing, which means recycling, in the near future. Canada is a leader in uranium mining, and our uranium reserves are far from being depleted. While some countries, including the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and Japan, continue to reprocess used fuel, other countries such as the United States, Germany, and Switzerland have issued a ban or moratorium on reprocessing. And the third reason why it's being discouraged in Canada is the necessary facilities are expensive and inevitably produce residual radioactive waste that could be more difficult to manage than used nuclear fuel in its unreprocessed form. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Brene.
Yes, thanks. I'm going to go back to the actual question, even though it was a long time ago it was posed, and speak to that. So of the three options, I think we've already touched several times on recycling and why it is not actually an alternative to a deep geological repository or on-site storage, because it doesn't eliminate or reduce the waste problem. It just changes it. and it has additional problems with it. If you look at some of the, the large reprocessing sites in the world, they're also the most heavily contaminated: Hanford, La Hague, Sellafield. It's not an alternative to a long-term storage system. I just want to comment that Kim has proposed that there's a new reactor design that could potentially reprocess Canadian fuel, CANDU fuel. But I want to emphasize at the end of her comment was that it's in the design stages. It's theoretical. It's a hypothetical reactor. So again, not a solution. Of the two options of what the question terms responsible stewardship versus a deep geological repository as selected by the NWMO, I think the reason the deep geological repository is in the #1 position is political momentum. Since 1977, 3 Men, 3 Months studied the problem of nuclear waste and said, bury it. And I think that the momentum, the political momentum of the federal government, I think even the assumptions of the regulator, and certainly the intentions of the industry have been going and pushing and, headed only in that direction. In terms of a risk analysis of the different options, the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act in 2002 directed the nuclear industry to organize themselves as a waste management organization, which became the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. I would disagree with Jason. They are the waste generators, the reactor operators, Ontario Power Generation, Hydro-Quebec, New Brunswick Power are the shareholders for the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. And I don't know why industry generally isn't upfront about that. I think they generally are. So I was surprised by Jason's comment in that regard. But they did do a desktop exercise looking at centralized storage, extended on-site storage. And then the NWMO said, well, we've come up with a 4th option that incorporates all 3, and they called it adaptive phase management. And that option has adapted. It has changed in many respects over the 15 years. But I would propose that the best alternative is extended on-site storage, not status quo storage. I think what you're referring to as responsible stewardship, we need hardened on-site storage. It will be a smaller space to pivot in terms of managing the waste, but it has many benefits. Some of the problems that are there on site now, I think could be addressed much more immediately than waiting 10, 20, 30 years, 40 years for the waste to be moved off site. B, I think that it avoids both the transportation risk and the carbon footprint of transportation. C, it avoids creating yet another nuclearized site, potentially in a remote, potentially in a far distant area, such as the Revel Lake area between Ignis and Dryden. And I think that it is the most secure option, not status quo, not building dry storage containers right by the lake, as OPG is proposing to do at Pickering, but pulling those containers back from the site, hardening them, making them more secure, more resilient to extreme weather, to malevolent acts, and really engaging in responsible action and responsible management over the long time. It allows monitoring, remediation, measuring performance, responding to failures, incorporating new science, and so on. And so I think it's clearly the preferred option. And I think it is really just political momentum that has brought us to the point we're at now, with a deep geological repository still being on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernine. Patrick.
Thanks, Tyler. This has been a really interesting discussion where we've touched on an awful lot of stuff. And I just want to stress that the Cnsc, as the regulator, we don't have a horse in this race. The NWMO is spending a lot of time and money on their proposal to get to a DGR. that's one way to approach this. And if they come to us with a license application, we will say, now tell us how you're going to make sure it's safe, all aspects of it. If OPG came to us, as Bernayne just described, and said, we are going to create a centralized storage facility, we would say, OPG, explain to us how you're going to make it safe, all aspects of it. So I just want to stress that regardless of who proposes what, that really is the only lens that we use to look at it. One very minor procedural point, there's a lot going on in the chat. A lot of people are sending things to all panelists and not all panelists and attendees. So I think people maybe aren't aware that that's an option, that you're restricting who can see what you send. And it might be an even more lively conversation if everyone could see everything.
Thank you, Patrick, for the reminder.
Probably
Jason, you had your hand up there.
Comments in the chat are not making any sense to the attendees because I'm trying to respond to questions that are directed at me.
Okay.
But thank you, Patrick. I hadn't realized that.
Jason, did you want to provide comment on this particular topic?
So in terms of responsible stewardship, I would certainly be okay with above ground storage, say, in South Bruce County, just having all of the spent nuclear fuel stay above ground where it's been. I don't think it's the best way to do it, but I don't think it's unsafe. I don't, of course they'd have to prove it to Cnsc, but the NWMO consulted with a lot of Canadians. The NWMO started off with a consultation model. They started off in conversation with lots and lots of Canadians. And what the Canadians came back with was, we want to have a deep geologic repository. So I don't think the 3 men in 3 months model is actually what led to the political momentum that had this. I also think that NWMO should get a chance to tell their own story on that front. But I do think the deep geologic repository does make a lot of sense. That's an opinion, but yeah.
Okay.
Marcelina, I think we're going to move to the next question, yeah?
Well, actually, yep, just before we do that, I'd like to go back to Kim and see if she'd like to finish up her comment.
Sure. I did just want to clarify about the relationship between the NWMO and the companies that own the nuclear fuel. It was mentioned that there's a shareholder relationship, which implies that the owners of the fuel kind of get something in return. I did just want to clarify that the model is that when a company purchases a fuel bundle to use to generate electricity, that fuel bundle is their responsibility. And the relationship is more at the purchase of the fuel bundle, you also have to purchase your disposal at the same time. And so those funds that get set aside, that's actually the arrangement, is when the fuel bundle gets purchased, there's a legislative requirement that the owner of the bundle must also pay for its disposal. So I did just want to clarify that. I also wanted to clarify, just based on a few of the things in the chat. I know that a number of folks have kind of talked about sort of reprocessing. And I did just want to emphasize that reuse and reprocessing are two different functions. With the fuel we have in Canada, some reactor designs are able to reuse that fuel. And so the reuse does not mean breaking up the fuel and then remanufacturing. Reuse is simply that. It's like your Chinese food container that you wash in the dishwasher and you take it out and you use it again for something else. And so there are reactor designs that can reuse without having to do any of the recycling activities. So I did want to make that clarification for folks. I hope it's helpful.
Thank you very much. And actually, we are going to move into our next question, and we will be starting with you. Kim, a great concern is shown for waterways in the region. They are and represent a source of food, employment, transportation, recreation, and cultural significance. NWMO has studied the water and shown that surface water and water found at the DGR depth are different and do not engage with one another easily. In your opinion, how can we be certain of this? Are there other examples of this we can research to verify or challenge these findings?
Thanks for the hard question.
You're welcome.
I would say, as a scientist, and I hate that I'm saying this in this context because I don't want to make people afraid. What can we know for certain? In life, almost every interaction we have is a series of reasonably assured moments. The scientific testing that goes into identifying bodies of water can include tests for different types of biotic life. So for example, in that case, the water will be sampled for microorganisms. If two bodies of water communicate, you should see similar or the same microorganisms in both bodies of water. And where you don't see that, there's a reasonable assurance that those two bodies of water don't communicate with each other. The other way that water can be tested is water can be tested for the presence of nuclear isotopes. And in that way, if you're seeing isotopes of a different age in one body of water versus a second body of water, again, you could draw a conclusion about whether those two bodies of water interact with each other. Within our Earth's surface, we have a number of underground rivers, we have a number of underground lakes, and some of those are connected to each other. And you can see examples of that, for example, when, if you have a well and your neighbor has a well and it's a very dry summer and your neighbor loves watering their lawn, your well might run dry. And so that's an example of an aquifer that's connected, that communicates with the bodies of water around it. You do often get water underground that is surrounded by rock formations that are completely cut off from all other surrounding bodies of water. For people who have questions about the studies that NWMO have done about water, I would encourage you to ask them to share their test data. I would encourage you to ask them about the laboratory testing that was done, as well as the methods that were used, and also what type of standardization procedures those labs had in place to ensure that there were no errors in the results that the lab has given. Another area that I would encourage you to ask about is the impact on standing and surface water due to the construction of the facility. During the environmental assessment process that will have to happen as a result of any facility, and the CNSC oversees this process as well, the impacts on things like water flows, food sources. For example, in Northern Ontario, there are still communities that live very heavily on the land. And when you flood certain areas, even during a construction period, that can have impacts on mercury levels in the environment. And so questions that would be good for people to ask during an environmental assessment would be, can you tell me about how you studied the effects during construction of the facility versus operation of the facility on both surface water and below ground waters?
Thank you, Kim. Dr. Greer.
Thank you. So I appreciate Kimberly mentioning that there are limits to what science knows and can resolve and tell us, because we as human beings are very limited in what we can know. And I have a powerful memory of attending every day of 2 public hearings for an earlier proposed DGR by Ontario Power Generation for low and intermediate level waste. And what happened frequently and what called for the second public hearing by the panel was the fact that OPG and its NWMO consultants could not answer some pretty important questions at that time. And I would suggest there are still a number of questions that cannot be answered, and the science is not there yet. Because science is not totally objective or all-knowing. Science is based on our limitations of what we can create science is one of our constructed types of knowledge. We construct reality as human beings to make meaning of life and reality the best we can. That's what we do as human beings, but we have limits the way that our cognitive mind works. And one of the big concerns I find in how not only in the nuclear industry, but perhaps it's increasing now too across all the environmental sciences, is the reliance on computer modeling. And many times when I've spoken publicly, I refer to a book written by a renowned physicist, Fritjof Capra, who interviewed computer scientists who pointed out that computers and computer modeling cannot mimic the natural world, the way that natural organisms operate, because natural organisms are continually in flux. And when a computer program is created, it's static, and human beings will perhaps try to create it to be flexible and put in certain symbols and so on based on the way our mind works to try to express how they are conceiving how the natural world operates. But computer modeling is relied upon a lot by the NWMO and its studies, and also by the CNSC in a number of the regulatory documents I've read. And it's very concerning to me because it is limited. Our measurement tools that we create as human beings is not good enough to really totally predict what could happen underground through time once inevitably containers will corrode and radionuclides do get released into the environment. And I have read a number of scientific journals through the years. That's what I've done when I speak out publicly on this issue. I go to science journals and I read that there is still a lot of studies not done, that there are different types of computer models that contradict each other in their results. And basically there's a lot of data still missing. There are huge information gaps to justify and confirm what could happen through time in the waterways and throughout the natural environment. So I could go on about this, but that's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Greer. Is there anyone else? Patrick.
Thanks, Tyler. Just to quickly pick up on a couple of points that have been mentioned by a few people. Agree with Sandy completely on computer modeling. It can be a really useful tool, but you have to be really careful with it. You have to make sure that you're evaluating the assumptions that are used in making that model. You have to make sure you're looking at your initial conditions, whether or not that model is validated with real world results. So when we have licensees come to us and say, my computer model says everything is safe, that's when we really get into that model. Tell us how you're confident that that model is appropriate for the use that you're putting it to. As we talk on the idea of water safety, I just want to bring up impact assessment. We had a question on that. I assume we've, in interest of time, passed over it, but we have this idea of impact assessment, which is formally known as environmental assessment. So there's new legislation dating to 2019 And if the NWMO, if their proposal progresses to licensing, they will have to undergo what's called an impact assessment, which is a holistic look at all the positive and negative benefits of a project. So this is a process that the Cnsc has a role in, but it's actually led by another separate agency called the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. We have an arrangement with them where we would work together to deliver on that. And I just want to stress that the idea of the safety of surface water and shallow groundwater would play a really large role in that, because obviously if there was any significant impact to that is a real major tripping point, right? We have people who live at the surface, we have people who rely on that water for drinking, for fishing. And so we would expect any applicant to be able to demonstrate to us exactly how any project would be protective of those waters. Tell us about your barriers, and then the real challenge is tell us about your barriers over the time frame that you're analyzing. So we have this idea of different phases of licensing, and I want to stress that an impact assessment covers all of them. So we would start an impact assessment in our early phases of licensing, but we would require that the applicant tell us how it's going to be safe right to the bitter end of that project. We're talking about very long time frames, and so that's a really tall order, and we haven't been through that yet. But I just wanted to sketch out for everyone what the process would look like if we do get to that it will be intensely scrutinized from a lot of different perspectives, and that the safety of the environment is central to that.
Thank you very much for that, Patrick. That has been an important question for folks to hear a response to. So thank you very much. Tyler, go ahead.
Yeah, no, Brenane just had her hand up there. Brenane, we could probably provide you within 1 minute, but we've got two other questions to get through in very limited time. So
I really need my 3 minutes on this one.
Okay, go ahead.
Within a minute. So first of all, coming back to the question, the way it's phrased, that NWMO has studied the water and shown that surface water and water found at DGR depth are different. I don't know when NWMO has come to that conclusion. That would require their drilling results, their drill program to be complete, and their drilling results to be released. Maybe they've done that internally. We've requested the drill results and have not, and they've not been made available. So to my knowledge, that's not yet established what the connections may or may not be between surface water at depth and water at surface. I think they are really important questions. The site, the Revel Lake site, is at the headwaters between the Wabigoon, English River, Wabigoon River system and the Turtle River Lake, the Wood system. Where surface would report, where the water at depth would report to surface, I don't think has been determined. I don't know if it can be determined by some, the drill program that the NWMO has ongoing. Certainly, I haven't found anything in their materials that suggests that they have knowledge as to where water at depth would report to surface. So we have two major watersheds which are at risk from releases from depth. And, I think that, barring a release as a result of an accident during transfer, the NWMO program design is unique in that it uses a shaft versus the ramp, which all the other international designs use a ramp. So I think there's a bigger risk factor there using the shaft. But barring that, the risk, by my understanding, increases over time with the increased probability that there will be releases as a result of the containers deteriorating. And I don't think there's a dispute. I don't think the NWMO disputes that there will be releases over time. Certainly Atomic Energy of Canada Limited didn't. The debate is not, will there be releases of radioactive releases to surface? The debate is how soon, how much, and what consequence. That's what the debate is. I appreciate Patrick's outlining that there will be an environmental assessment. In this case, one of the difficulties with the siting, with the 9-step process, is that the environmental assessment comes in step 7. Detailed site characterization doesn't come until step 8. And, you know, we do have the experience of the Deep Geological Repository for low and intermediate level waste. And in that review, we found that many of the technical questions, the tough technical questions, or even obvious technical questions like the shaft collar, were punted on past the EA stage into licensing. And certainly in this case, if a detailed site characterization isn't going to be done until after the environmental assessment, these fundamental questions about the connection between water at depth and surface water, they rely on that detailed site characterization. So there's a real problem with the ordering there. All we can get at the EA stage, based on the steps as they're set out currently, would be predictions. And I don't, you know, I don't know that that's going to be reliable enough. I don't believe it will be. The other issue, of course, is around monitoring this risk to water surface. One of the real disadvantages of a deep geological repository is it's much more difficult to monitor and to measure performance of the containers and to identify when they're failing, to what degree they're failing, compared to it being on surface or near surface. And the NWMO to date does not have a detailed monitoring plan. They put out a paper a few years ago that was along the lines of towards a detailed monitoring plan. That's not the title, but that's the flavor of the title. The last monitoring plan, actual monitoring plan, was several years ago, and it was very simple. And it was basically drill a hole, drop a sensor down, every 20 years, bring it up, read it, replace it. That's not sufficient. If, you know, when and if there is when there is loss of containment at depth, it's going to be very, 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 very difficult to do anything about it. And in the absence of a really detailed monitoring plan, monitoring program, no one will know. And finding out that there's been a release that reports to surface after it's reported to surface, highly unlikely to be detected, because the reporting could be in such a wide range of locations, and B, too late to remediate it. We can't even remediate mine sites. It's very difficult to remediate groundwater contamination. So imagine from a deep geological repository. So I think there are a number of challenges, and I'll be interested to follow the program if this DGR does go forward, but I am not confident that these technical challenges can be resolved. Was that 3 minutes or less?
You did pretty close there, Brittany.
Thank you.
Patrick, we'll have to keep it very brief.
I just want to remind everyone where we are in the process. So monitoring, Brene, absolutely, it's a really important aspect. They haven't picked a site yet. And so from a Cnsc point of view, we wouldn't necessarily be worried that they don't have a monitoring program at this stage. When they get to the point where they want to start having an impact on the environment, we want to start seeing more thought in that kind of direction. When they get to the point where they say, now we want to bring radioactive substances, absolutely, you can bet that the Cnsc will be there front and center saying, tell us exactly how you're going to be monitoring the impacts of the activities that you're performing on that site. So I just wanted to stress that in some cases it might seem like the NWMO is not ready. I would say at this point, that could be appropriate depending on what topic area we're talking about. They are their own biggest boosters. Their optimistic timeline is that we are more than 20 years out from operation. And personally, I would say maybe that's too short. It might take longer than that. So there is a lot that they have yet to demonstrate. At this point, I think that's okay because they aren't doing anything and they aren't asking for a license to do anything yet.
Thank you. Marcelina?
Sorry. Okay, thank you everyone. And we are now going to-
I haven't had a chance to respond to this question yet, and I'd like to.
Oh, Jason, yeah.
Oh,
go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Thank you. To be clear, we do have naturally occurring deposits of radioactive material that have stayed in place longer than this DGR needs to exist. We have been able to go and find things like the Northern Saskatchewan uranium mines, Cigar Lake and so forth, that have kept uranium with no communication between the water at depth and surface water. And we are studying those to figure out how can we make sure that happens again. There was a naturally occurring nuclear reactor 2 billion years ago in West Africa, the Oklo-Gabon natural nuclear reactor. And the rock formation held all of the radioactive nuclides in place since before there were fish on this planet, let alone people. So we have seen geology hold this in place with no surface contamination whatsoever that's happened from that. So we're not just using computer models to study this stuff. We're actually having different groups of people approach this problem from as many different angles as they can, because that's how science is done. Science is not uniquely computer models. It's computer models, it's field experiments, it's a lot of different things and different tools all coming at the same problem from different angles, trying to come up with an answer that everybody can agree on, or at least a range of answers that everybody can agree on. So in the case of how do we know it's going to be safe? We've already seen this happen in nature. The rock is strong enough.
Thank you, Jason. Marcelina.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so moving on into our last segment of the agenda, and it is public engagement. Dr. Greer, why are the long-standing viewpoints and concerns regarding the future management of nuclear waste from organizations such as Northwatch and Environment North becoming more widespread right now, and what can we learn from these advocacy groups? In your opinion, what questions should we be asking moving forward?
Oh boy. Well, I believe a long list of questions, too long for tonight's discussion, but I think it's really important that there are citizen groups who are making themselves aware about the limits of information that is made available to them, and to really raise intelligent questions about what the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is telling us and what it is not telling us, because for one reason, it doesn't have the knowledge and it doesn't have the answers. And so it's really important that a larger number of Canadian citizens do their own independent research to understand what they're not being told, and to understand the dangers much more clearly than what the NWMO is willing to admit most of the time. There is not enough transparency from the NWMO, and I can tell you that from being involved with various groups in Midwestern Ontario for the last 10 years, community groups who have intelligent people in them, who have done a lot of their own research to discover what types of serious information gaps are presented even at the public hearings. And another issue about the limits of the NWMO working with communities, it does not, in my view, it is not honorable in the way that it engages grassroots communities. And I am witnessing this, living in a region right now, which is, I lived in South Bruce for 13 years, and now I'm just right next door in the next county, about a half an hour away from where my farmhouse was. So for the past couple of years, I've worked with a local group called Protect Our Waterways, No Nuclear Waste. And I've shared my own science research through the years with them, which I continue to try to keep updated. And they are doing their own research. And the NWMO and previously the OPG throughout Bruce County, they will never agree to do a town hall with the entire community to sit there and answer questions from a full community of people and to speak publicly or to ever sit on a panel with people who have issues and concerns about the proposed DGRs. They only will go to small groups of people in which they have total control over the information transfer, and where there's just very few questions asked, instead of involving like the whole community together. So there's more public disclosure of the concerns, and people can come together as a unit, a unified community with their concerns, and hear each other out. And so this is absolutely disgraceful that the NWMO is operating the communities in a way that is not transparent, and where it just will go to you know, service clubs or, you know, business groups and so on and so forth, where they really control like what is going to be communicated. And so I think it's really disgraceful how the NWMO is operating on the ground in the communities, because it is not the way that it asserts it is operating. And so that's a really major concern. And I do believe that Dryden, you absolutely have a right to be involved in participating in this whole process as it unfolds, as do all of the surrounding communities, most particularly all of the First Nation and Métis communities in the larger region, should be involved now in the process and engage now, and for people to have dialogues across communities, and for everybody to be included and to really be informed about the DGR, about why it is being presented as the go-to way to deal with nuclear waste, and why other options such as rolling stewardship is just being sidelined and not given. And I believe, like, honestly, I would like to say that I would really appreciate if Dryden, for one of its future gatherings for public discourse, could invite Dr. Gordon Edwards to speak about rolling stewardship and to really explain what that means about that other option, about until a future time when we might have technologies and safer resolutions about how to deal with nuclear waste, that there could be a rolling stewardship program put into place where generation after generation will be able to take responsibility until a better resolution could happen. Because according to the NWMO documents and also some of the Cnsc regulations, there will be no institutional control after 300 years. It's just terminated. There will be no institutional control or oversight after 300 years. So then, like, what choices do future generations have? And it's all underground. And so that does not leave a freedom of choice to the future generations. And
Dr. Greer, we're gonna have to stop you there and see if there's another panelist who would like to address this question, but thank you. It was a very well-rounded answer.
Kim
Go
has
ahead.
her hand up. Yep.
I would definitely like to add to this discussion. I think the original question, Marcelina, was what can we learn from groups that are sort of advocating? Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, because that's a question I'd like to answer. For me, when I see groups that are really disagreeing with sort of a way forward, what I see is need for more discussion, for more forums like this, where people can share their views. When I think myself about being an Indigenous person who is a proponent of the nuclear industry, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how my work aligns with my morality. And as a young child, I grew up in a very small community in Newfoundland. We grew up without electricity when I was very young. And that makes life very difficult, not having access to electricity, because that means that you also don't have access to running water. You don't have access to treated water. And those were certainly situations that I faced as a young girl. And when I think about the ways that we have available to us to generate electricity, when we overlay climate change, when we overlay air pollution, when we overlay the release of heavy metals and radioactive carbon from coal plants, I really believe that the approach that Ontario has taken in terms of electricity generation is the best we've got with what's available to us. When I think 7 generations in the future, waste is something that I believe we have a duty to deal with. For myself, I will share that I don't really have a preference over DGR versus responsible stewardship. I do wonder, though, if we will ever have that better technology in the future, and whether we might find ourselves in a position where our children and our grandchildren don't have the resources to be able to be the stewards of that waste that we need them to be while it's above ground. And so for that reason, I can certainly see where a DGR makes sense, because we at least know that, you know, the conditions can be kept constant over that 7 generations, whereas above ground, things are a little less certain. At the same time, there is a lot that's not known about the DGR solution. There is a lot of research. There is a lot of questions. And I think those conversations are necessary. And I know that, you know, the science communication is something that is an interest of mine. And when I see some of the comments and folks say, well, you know, we speak to scientists, or we speak to this person and the scientist said this, the messages that come across to a particular question, they're really complicated. And for a scientist who may have to go into, you know, 10 chemical reactions, or, you know, how do you explain to somebody the nuances of, you know, subsurface water flow? It can be a very difficult field. People spend 20 to 40 years becoming experts in these fields, and now we're asking them we're demanding that they give us answers in 30 seconds or less. And that can be difficult. I would encourage people to ask those open-ended questions and to talk with people beside them, because for me, coming together is the only way towards a future that we can all be proud of.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you.
Very eloquently put. Renee.
Yes, thanks, Tyler. So I think the question is about, you're asking, why did the longstanding viewpoints and concerns of groups like Northwatch and Environment North become more widespread right now? And I would suggest that it's more a case of them being more widely expressed. I think the concerns have probably, you know, been there throughout, but they're becoming more widely expressed. And I think that is probably for a couple of reasons. One is in 2020, when the NWMO shortlisted to 2 areas, South Bruce and the Revel Lake area, which is associated with Ignace, that I think sounded some alarm bells for people, because I've heard from many, many people in both the Northwest and the Southwest that they didn't think it would come to this, that they did not think their area would stay in the process, would make, you know, would find itself on a short list. So I think a lot of people just preferred to not wade in. And now they are wading in. I think also the shortlisting to 2020 in 2020, and then the decision point being announced for 2023 makes it more immediate for people. And I think there are also certainly we're hearing in the Northwest there are still lots of people who hadn't heard about it before. Certainly our own organization, Northwatch, back in step 2, we were doing workshops. We did workshops in the 13 different Northern Ontario communities that had engaged in the NWMO process. And in step 2, our focus was more on equipping people to engage in the discussion. So they weren't really advocacy workshops. They were, here's the history, here are the terms, here are the basic concepts, to try to support people engaging in the process. And as the process has moved through the different phases of step 3, I think that we're much more overt in our criticisms. And I think that there's lots to be critical of. I was struck by Patrick's comment that the NWMO doesn't have a monitoring package or a monitoring program now because that's still a long way down the road. Well, it's not a long way down the road for people who are going to be asked to make a decision. We still don't know in the case of the Revel Lake area how that community is going to be defined, because as we all know, Revel Lake area is 40-some kilometers outside of the municipality of Ignace. And we don't know the mechanism that will be used to measure this compelling demonstration of willingness, but the NWMO says they're looking for willing and informed communities. Well, it's a package. This is a project, it's a package, and it includes not just the DGR design, many aspects of which are not yet developed, not yet known. We don't yet know about either of the 2 sites that are being investigated. We don't know about the transportation, not the mode, but we also, there's been very little publicly disclosed about things like the packaging, certainly the route. Although we could speculate on it, we know the NWMO has said very little about the fuel packaging plant and all that entails, and that is another entire risk area. And certainly we don't know about monitoring, we don't know about retrievability. There's this ever-present possibility of reprocessing being tacked on. We know little about the, in terms of the waste that will be generated on the site. All the NWMO says is they'll be sent off site to a licensed facility, which is very similar to what the reactor communities have always been told about the fuel waste. So there's a whole bunch of unknowns, and yet this informed and willing community is to make that decision somehow by 2023. So I think that that's why we're hearing more. People have a lot of questions, and it feels like a very short timeline for getting answers. So thank you. Less than 3 minutes.
Thank you. Great job, Renee.
Yep.
Dr. Denev or yes. Patrick, do you have any comments?
Yes, actually, Tyler, I was going to ask if Dr. Denev would like to say something because he had to leave.
Yes.
So what questions should we be asked going forward? Demand conversations with the NWMO. Demand it. Absolutely insist on having conversations with the NWMO and talk with the CNSC. The CNSC is your regulator. They are the government organization that keeps the public safe when it comes to all things nuclear. With all due respect, Patrick, bug Patrick. We've got 2 other people from the CNSC here as well. Get to know people from the CNSC and ask them the hard questions. Ask them in an environment where there can be a dialogue and you can actually nuance the question through until you both feel like you've actually come to some conclusion. I really like what Kimberly said about that. There is an office in Ignace right now that has people who work for the NWMO, and I encourage anybody to drive down to Ignace, walk into the office and ask every single question you've got. And if they can't answer you offhand, they'll probably say, we'll get back to you. But be clear, you do have the right to ask these questions. And as Bernane said, You absolutely should ask these questions. Questions you should ask. What is radiation? How does it work? What can be done to make sure that it doesn't harm people? How are you keeping my family safe? You should go and you should ask the NWMO that, because they do have good answers, in my opinion. But the important thing is not my opinion. This isn't my community. You need to figure out whether or not you are comfortable with their answers for your community, because this is your home. Ask about how nuclear reactors create radioactive isotopes to treat cancer and diagnose disease. Ask what nuclear science and technology actually is beyond nuclear power. Ask about things like what's in the chat right now, the claims that nuclear is really dirty. It's not. I've toured nuclear facilities. I've toured coal facilities. One of them is dirty, the other is not. Ask about how nuclear tourism will create opportunities in Dryden. Ask why experts in nuclear science and technology are willing to raise their families next to nuclear reactors. I was called a liar by one of the people in the chat. It's not just me. People who are experts in nuclear are raising their families next to nuclear reactors right now. Why are they doing that? You should ask questions like that. Ask what's good about nuclear and ask what's bad about it. There are definitely some downsides to nuclear. Okay? So demand those answers. Demand the opportunity for you as individuals to go, and don't take my word for it. Go and talk to the NWMO directly. See if they can answer your questions. And if you have questions about their answers because you don't consider them to be good, go to the Cnsc, come to me, come to other nuclear experts, come to people and say, I heard these things from the NWMO. In order to make a decision about complicated technology, you're going to need to spend the time. And that's the unfortunate part of this. This is complicated and time needs to be spent. Thank you.
Thank you. And before you leave, Dr. Dunev, I know you're in a rush.
You can wait 5 minutes. It's fine.
Okay. Just wanted to.
It's not that much of a rush. Go ahead and close up with the questions. I'll hang out.
No, I actually wanted to go back to the one word / phrases that we asked people about. So just wanted to go back to yours in the event that you do have to leave. So you had put forward the word listening, which I believe you have, it's been a theme throughout a lot of your responses. If there's anything you want to leave as a takeaway for our audience in keeping with your listening word, please provide that.
It's important to listen because we don't know everything. It's important to listen because it helps us figure out the limits of what we do know and what we don't know. Where are we confident? Where are we wrongly confident? When I started looking at nuclear power, I was really confident that nuclear power was awful, but I didn't have any information. I didn't know how a nuclear reactor worked. The more I learned about it, when I came with an open mind and an open heart, because I was forced to, I slowly came to understand that the people I had been listening to, who were trying to convince me that nuclear was really dangerous, were themselves scared and actually didn't understand how things worked. It's important for us to listen with an open mind because sometimes the people we're listening to do have these blind spots. And when we listen carefully, and I certainly have my own blind spots. So if you listen to me, please listen for what are my blind spots, but listen for all of that because this isn't my community. This is your decision, not mine. Thanks. Thank
you very much. Anyone else? Would you like to, somebody would just like to go, or would you like me to call on someone who'd like to follow up with their word and or phrase, and I can remind you of what it was if you need.
I can go.
Thank you.
I think mine was essential, and I think the discussion here tonight has just reinforced that. I think in the closing remarks here, a few speakers have touched on the idea of the value of these dialogues for the community, and I think it's really positive that you're having these dialogues at this time. Nothing is final yet. I think it was either Brené or Sandy who mentioned that the NWMO is seeking to find an informed and willing host community. That's you. That's a really high bar. This is not a simple project. It's polarizing. now is the time to find out whether you think that this is the right thing for your community. And I just want to say that even though I've made a point a few times to say that we are before licensing, we are before the Cnsc's formal process starts. The Cnsc is here to support Dryden, Ignace, South Bruce, whatever other community members, Indigenous peoples want to reach out to us to try and learn more about our role in this, about how they can interact with our role, with our processes. I think it was said that we really are your regulator, and I want to reiterate that. We're here to make sure that if someone comes up with a proposal, that it can be delivered safely, and that is ultimately the purpose that we're here to serve. So people said reach out to me by name. You can do that. We have an info line, we have a website. If I'm not the right person to respond to your questions, then I'll help find the right person within the organization to do that.
We absolutely appreciate that, and we will be taking you up on that offer. Thank you kindly. Kim, would you like to go?
Sure. My phrase was saving the world. And for me, that is something that I put forward in everything that I do. Because for me, I want to know that my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren will be able to look back in their past and be proud of who they are. And for me, access to electricity is the difference when I look at Indigenous communities. It's the difference between being able to provide clean water for the community and not being able to provide clean water for the community. It's the difference between having houses that people can live in and having to build up tarps around wood stoves to stay warm. And so for me, being able to provide reliable electricity is extremely, extremely important.
Thank you very much. Dr. Greer?
My phrase was equality across all cultures. And so that embraces all of the Indigenous people throughout this entire region. And in terms of food security for the future, and thinking, you know, not just 7 generations ahead, but a longer term past the next 300 years, I pray with all my heart that the water will still be safe to use in all the waterways. And I fear that would not happen if a DGR were constructed and radionuclides were released into the waterways and impact a lot of other living organisms. And it moves up all the trophic levels all the way through and would affect the fish and the animals and ultimately human beings as well. So I don't want to see that fate for the Indigenous people in the future or for anyone else. And we are a human family. And I really would love if we could have cross-cultural dialogues right now to really come together and speak from our hearts together with good minds together to really have conversations on this important issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Lloyd?
Thanks, Marshallina. I think my word was resilience, and maybe that was my word because I think that's what I'm seeing across the Northwest over the last, period of time. I literally am getting calls and emails from people from throughout the region, and what I'm hearing from them is resilience. I'm hearing from a number of people who are telling me that they interacted with Atomic Energy of Chem Limited when they were doing site investigations in the 1970s and 1980s, and they are still on the issue. And I'm hearing from people who are brand new to the issue, and they're spending time learning, reading, talking, asking questions. And I think that's resilience. And I think that I can't tell the NWMO to expect that there will be a willing community, but I can tell them to expect that there will be an informed community. And that community is Northwestern Ontario. It's, you know, it's not a municipality 40 kilometers away from the site that's being investigated. It's the region. And I think it's a resilient region. And I think that it's a privilege to be part of their conversation and part of the conversation tonight. So I thank you for that, City of Dryden, Mayor Wilson and Tyler and Marshallina. It's been great discussion.
Thank you very much. Not certain if there's anything else anybody would like to say before we end the evening. Mayor Wilson, are you still online? Would you like to say anything? If you are.
No, I've just thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. I think it's been good debate, good substance. The material has been very relevant to the community, and I appreciate the input of everyone. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you very much for coming. And we would like to let everyone know that we are very much looking forward to organizing some future sessions for our stakeholders. I am certain that we will be receiving some feedback tomorrow and in the coming weeks. And we just really probably cannot even appropriately articulate just how much we have valued your agreeing to provide this information to the City of Dryden and area. Tyler, would you like to say anything?
Ditto. Yeah. No, it's been awesome to be part of this, and thank you to all of our panelists for providing this opportunity to the community in the region. At one point this evening, I believe I saw over 65 participants within the audience, which is incredible to see. It's a benchmark for us, and by no means is this the end. I believe this is actually quite the opposite. This is the start of our opportunity to continue these discussions. So thank you to everyone who chimed in the chat. Unfortunately, it's been absolutely on fire, and I haven't been able to keep up with it, but we do have everything documented, and we will be able to follow up afterwards. So again, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you to everyone for choosing to participate.
Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you. Good night.
Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thanks all and good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Student Ethan would really like to chat with you.
Okay, and we are very much looking forward to that. And enjoy your next session.
Thanks.
Thank you for staying. Bye, Kim. It was good to see you.
Good to see you.
Bye, Miss Lloyd. Bye, Dr. Greer. We're the last ones here. Yeah, we had 71, Tyler.